He was a man who took care of his workforce. He was known for taking care of for all those who worked for him. And he treated others as he would treat his own family. Him and his family were highly esteemed in the area. His biggest blessing, though, were his two sons. And they grew up on the farm, on his land, learning everything about the business. Probably like from early in the morning going out feeding from as kids. They grew up and they learned everything about his business because one day they would take it over. One day it would be theirs. They wanted for nothing through their lives, as of course they were very, very wealthy. Occasionally the family would go on trips to the city, and as they got older they would go on the trips to the city with their father and buy and sell at markets. They would conduct business. No doubt they would also spend a bit of time enjoying some of the sights. If you don't live in a city like London or somewhere, people come and travel in occasionally for things, and then they'll usually take some excuse to stay a bit longer or see some sights. I've got friends who come from different parts of the country, occasionally come into London for a conference or for something else, and they'll try and see a show or they'll try and do something, see a part of London while they're here. One of his sons, the younger as it turns out, he kind of got restless with this way of life. He came into the big city and he kind of hankered after the fast, exciting life that he saw in the city, like many before and many since, all around the world. And eventually, he could no longer put up with this mundane existence on the land, in the farm, in the comfort of their estate, surroundings he'd known all of his life. And so, cashing in on his inheritance, on his future inheritance, he left his father's estate. He left the land for a life in the city, to make his own way, to do something more with his life. Though what? I don't think he knew. So he took an apartment in the best place in town. He enjoyed the food, and there was lots of it, the entertainment, the endless shows that were on. He enjoyed the nightlife that made the early nights of the farm become a really distant memory. He enjoyed days at the races, at the casino tables, and his life was filled with no shortage of things to do, no shortage of companions. And they were all wanting to be around him and wanting to help him to eat, drink, and be merry. So he's having a great time. And then, of course, the recession hit. And his dwindling investments, because he was spending it faster than it was making money, they crashed. He ran out of money very, very quickly. And finding himself with no income or assets, he couldn't borrow. The banks were closed to him. And his friends were all suddenly out of town, and so not able to help him. And one day he thought, well, there's nothing else for it. I've got to bite the bullet and I've got to get some work. But what did he know how to do? Well, he knew what life was like on the farm, didn't he? And times were hard, and there were no manufacturing jobs, there were no management jobs. All he could do was get a job looking after the animals. He got the lowest of the lowest unskilled jobs, basically hanging around where the animals slept, where the animals lived, and feeding them and just helping himself to whatever he could get to eat. Ironically, he didn't know that leaving his farm life, he would end up back on a farm, feeding pigs for no real wages, nothing but a roof in the barn. And one day he realised how far he had fallen, how his search for happiness, how his search for fulfillment, for the best in life had led him to the lowest place that he couldn't even have imagined. He saw how his independence had really become a life of dependence. Dependence on his finances, dependence on the buzz and the excitement, dependence on being looked up to and having lots of people around him. And he began to long for his old life. It's a story told slightly differently by Jesus. We refer to it sometimes as the prodigal son. It's probably better known, it should probably be more the father's love. You know, the loving father, or the father's love, or the father who loves. Prodigal son is what we know it as. Got a quote from St. Augustine. St. Augustine of Hippo, some 16 centuries ago. I think there's a little one with it. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and your hearts are restless until they rest in you. Can we get that on screen? Is that right? You've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That's 1600 years ago. That's what St. Augustine said. And this guy was restless. He was restless. He was searching for a better life, searching for something more in life. And it's always been the same. It's always been how it is. Got another quote. Now this one comes from, might be familiar to you. In fact, that last one might be familiar to you, and this next one might be familiar to you, but not familiar. I remember hearing people say that everyone has a God-shaped hole inside of them that only God can fill. And I thought, well, that was a quote from somewhere. Well, actually, it's not a direct quote. It's something that the sentiment's good, and the thinking is good, and it becomes something useful to remember. But the background of it would be two things. Would probably be this quote by St. Augustine, and this next one I'm going to give you from Blaise Pascal. What else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim, but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help that he cannot find in those that are. Though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. So that's the quote from which people derive that thing that, you know, there's a God-shaped hole, which is a good way to remember it. A lot easier to remember than that quote, but that's the quote. And so whether it was St. Augustine or Pascal, people have understood and realised that we have this quest, this search for happiness that doesn't satisfy. Because there's this hole, it's like a black hole that nothing can fill. It sucks everything into it, sucks all of life, it sucks everything we have and leaves us ultimately dissatisfied. Restlessness and longing are universal traits of the human heart. The writer in Ecclesiastes 3 says that God has put eternity into our hearts. He's put eternity into our hearts. There's something in our hearts that the whole thing of eternity longs for that, and so nothing else can fill. We have an inconsolable longing. We try to satisfy it with great holidays, with bursts and feelings of creativity, with incredible cinematic productions, with sexual exploits, with big sporting events. This afternoon my team has got a test event for the brand new stadium, for the first test event, and I'll be checking in later what people are saying about the stadium. I'm hopefully going there next weekend, next Saturday, to have a look at it myself. You know, Hallucinogenic drugs. Some of us have experimented, and people experiment with hallucinogenic drugs. Maybe we go down the line of, well, we're just going to be excellent in what we do, in our job, in our management position. But whatever it is, the longing still remains, a restlessness and longing in our hearts. Isaiah put it like this in Isaiah 55, verses 2 to 3. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labour for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in abundance. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. And God says, come to me. Come to me. Why do you seek here, there and everywhere? There are those today who like this. Your soul is hungry and your heart is thirsty. You feel an insatiable longing for something. You're restless. Almost everywhere you turn, the grass is greener than where you stand. And the great tragedy for some of you is that even though this is the Spirit of God calling you to Himself, you turn away again and again to short-term fixes, temporary fixes, backfiring pleasures, and pursue just the latest fads. If I had £1 for every time someone said, Pastor, I need something more. If only I move, if only I change jobs, if only I learn a new skill, if only I pass my exams, if only I get a nice holiday, if I find a new church where everyone is lovely, etc., life will be better. Then I would be rich. I would be rich. In the 30 years or so of ministry that I've done, I tell you, pound for everyone, I've heard same and same again. Whether it was working in the streets of Glasgow with drug addicts who said, oh, well, I'm going to get a new flat, I'm going to get this, life's going to be better. So, well, you're still the same person. You've still got the same longings. You've still got the same things. That ain't going to change you, but I know somebody who can change you. I know somebody who can satisfy. Life will be better, people think. Sadly, so often, these people just end up down another cul-de-sac of unfulfilled promise. And we've been there, haven't we? We've been there, down those cul-de-sacs of promise that ultimately leave us dissatisfied. Well, Jesus had something to say about longing, which is great. He's got something to say to us this morning about this universal experience of inconsolable longing. He's something to say about this kind of totally insatiable hunger of the human heart and about our relentless thirst. So his words are found in Matthew 5 and 6. And let's read from Matthew 5:3 again, read through the Beatitudes. God blesses those who are poor and realise their need for Him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the earth. And God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And it's verse 6. In the NLT, it says, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice or righteousness. And many other translations say righteousness. And I want, perhaps righteousness, as we go on, conveys the thoughts better than the translation justice, but we'll look at that briefly. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I just want to talk to you and just unpack this a little. These words of Jesus, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. He speaks about the nature of righteousness, we need to look, well, what's he talking about? What is this righteousness? And also, we can examine the nature of our hunger and our thirst. What is it? And how can this hunger turn into satisfaction, the satisfaction that he promises that we might have? So what's the righteousness he's talking about? Well, it's not a moral superiority. It's not a code of conduct, as often we think it is. Oh, they're righteous people because they do certain things, they behave in certain ways, they dress in certain ways. No, it's a state of being in a right relationship with God. A relationship of trust, a relationship of obedience to God. It's a place of conforming to the will of God and to his purposes and his plans, to his heartfelt desires. It's a place of rightness with the Creator. That's the righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for this right relationship with God, who want to be right with God, who want to do his will, who want to achieve his purposes, who are so connected with God. They're not just like Facebook friends, who ignore each other when it's something they don't want to talk about, but they really have a relationship, and they don't just share the best bits of their lives and the exciting places they've been to and the things they've eaten, but life is shared in reality, in the whole, 360 degrees, 24/7. Life is shared together. This beatitude, unlike one or two of the others, is not a quote from the Old Testament. And the word righteousness, you'll find, occurs 5 times in this sermon. This verse 6, verse 10, verse 20, chapter 6, verses 1 and verse 33. So to understand Jesus' meaning, we're just going to look at a couple of those. The next time we see this word righteousness used is in verse 10. It says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, many commentators have noticed, and you may have noticed in your reading, so hopefully you've been reading Matthew 5 to 7 through, but you've noticed in the 8 Beatitudes that there are 2 groups of 4. The first 4 and the second. And this word righteousness comes in at the end of the first group of 4, and it comes in at the end of the next group of 4 as well. The first group of 4 ends with, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," and the second group of 4 ends, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." With that emptiness, there's a longing for fulfillment. And Jesus understands that. Jesus knows that. Jesus came. So I've come to give you life, and life in all its fullness. The New Testament talks about Jesus as being the one who fulfills the Old Testament. It's the one who fulfills all our dreams, all our expectations, all the things that we think we crave and what we have. He does that. The 3 Beatitudes we've had before, leading up to hunger for righteousness, are descriptions of emptiness or passivity. Poverty-stricken in spirit, talks about in verse 3. Mourning over sin and our misery, verse 4. Meekly accepting criticism without retaliation or defensiveness, in verse 5. Now, these are not characteristics, are they, of overflowing fullness. They're characteristics of brokenness. They're characteristics of understanding our emptiness and our lack. So it's natural then that the 4th one, the 4th Beatitude, or Macarisms, if you said before, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who long to be filled with righteousness," as we're saying. Hunger and thirst, we long to be filled with it. We're so desperate that we have to have it. And so this is what we find. After hunger and satisfaction, we then get the next 4, which are blessed are the merciful. Now, the blessed person is full and overflowing in mercy, not just a broken and sorrowful and meek, but someone who's now active and overflowing with deeds of mercy. Verse 8 says that person is pure in heart. And verse 9 says that they're not just peaceful, but they're peacemakers. So can you see the transition from that brokenness, from that emptiness, from that saying we lack? The next 4 Beatitudes show the positive side, show of what that person is and what that person brings. The second group of 4 Beatitudes ends with another reference to righteousness. Only this time it's not a hunger for righteousness, but a persecution for righteousness, for which we're overflowing with. Not something that we're longing for and we're lacking, that righteousness, but a righteousness that flows out of us. Yeah. In chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then what follows, and you can read it yourself in chapter 5, are 6 illustrations about how, as disciples, how as followers of Jesus, their righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Interesting reading. So it's not good enough to be that, but it's this, and looking at it, we're going to say, oh, but we can't do that. And that's, again, the whole point. Jesus is saying, no, these are because of you're in the kingdom of God. These are because you're part of my family. This is because as you've been transformed into disciples, and this is how you should be. And so the Christian life is not a search for fulfillment. It's not a search for getting, because we're hungry and thirsty and we've got to find some answer. It's actually comes from, hey, I'm satisfied. And I know my own life. I know where I was before I was a Christian. Yeah, I wasn't that old, but I was old enough to have explored a number of things. I was old enough to seek a number of things. I was old enough to have written off a lot of things in this life. But I was prepared to seek and to try and find something that would fulfill me ultimately. And when I came to Christ, when Christ found me, and I knelt down and I gave my life to Christ, and I got up feeling satisfied. And that feeling of being satisfied has never left me. I'm not hungry and thirsty and thinking there's something better out there. There's something greater. Because He satisfies, because I know what life's about, because that purpose, it gives you that feeling of that nothing else could ever have done. I don't have to spend my life chasing pursuits, but Lord, what can I do for you? How do I serve you? How do you want me to live out my life? That's what it is. How can I be your ambassador? How can I help men and women? The change was like that. It was like that. You know, it's like you're really, really thirsty and you get a good drink, you know, and you're satisfied, and somebody offers you a drink, it's all right, don't need it because I'm okay. Or you've had a really, really, really good meal and you sit down and somebody offers you something, I just can't eat anymore because actually I'm satisfied, I'm full, I'm okay. And that was my experience, and that's what Jesus says. Here's the experience of the follower and believer. The nature of that hunger and thirst. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We've talked a lot about it. And I've got a very long quote from C.S. Lewis. This is just to show that not only Danny can do long quotes from C.S. Lewis, but I can do long quotes from C.S. Lewis as well. Yeah. Okay, so you have to try and follow this one, and maybe it's something you want to look up for yourself. Okay? It's very easy. I mean, sound bites are great, and I love little sound bites, but sometimes you just need to see where those come from, and somebody's thinking is beyond and see where he's thinking. And C.S. Lewis kind of lets you into a lot of that when he writes. The Christian says, creatures are not born with desires, unless satisfaction for their desires exists. So, for example, a baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or an echo or a mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of my life to press on to that country and to help others to do the same. The hunger and thirst of your life that cannot be satisfied by anything in this world, be satisfied by God. It's the constant, if you like, it's the constant and beckoning and encouragement of God to remember that we were made for another world. You were made for God. And so that hunger and that thirst is in us to drive us to God, to drive us to Him who only can satisfy us and care for us. That's the reason that we have that drive. And so we look for all other things. The Bible talks about the broken systems of this world. We go to all sorts of other things to satisfy and then find it doesn't. It's a personal state of being, this righteousness, place of satisfaction, of righteousness, God. It's a personal state of being, of relationship, that then brings our actions towards others that are right. And so that's why from verse 6, you see things begin to work out from there that touch other people, the kind of people that we become, that reach out, that touch other people's lives, that impact the world. Why? Because we're not just hungry and thirsty consumers, but we've now got something within us that overflows. It's a personal state of being, of relationship that brings our actions towards others that are right. The translation, as I said, that's in the NLT of justice, can be a bit too narrow in our thinking, as the passage doesn't directly speak about social action or rights, but it speaks of a life, a state of being of righteousness that's justified with God, that's right with God, that leads to actions that are just. So out of the righteousness, out of the being made right and justified with God, comes lives that are just and produce justness and right things in this world. Do we understand that? Does that make sense? That's what's saying. So the conclusion is, make righteousness your passion and be satisfied. Make it your passion and be satisfied. We have a hunger and thirst for doing God's will that comes from the very heart of our being, and that justice will be done everywhere, and that His righteousness will prevail. Jesus taught them how to pray. Thy kingdom come. Lord, let your kingdom come. Let your will be done. I would say it's never too late to change your diet. We started off talking about fruit and other things, but to change our diet. What do you plan to eat tomorrow? Then why not plan to eat righteousness?